Can we reimagine the systems we live in? How can economics reflect our common humanity? And can we change it in time?
Welcome back to Real Time with Steve and friends. We've got Ty today. That's me. I'm the guest and I'm the host. We're going to be talking about economic modeling. It's going to be fun. Be kind, stay safe, and enjoy the show. Welcome back to Real Time with Steve and friends. Another episode. I guess I'm hosting today and I'm the guest. That's pretty interesting. There might be some bias going on. Danger Zone, you've changed your name. Danger Zone with his huge hammer. Mike is not here today, Danger Zone, so he won't be able to see it, but maybe next week. Blue Bay, Dre Guy, Tony Wilson in the house. Who else do we got here? Moed Branian Hussein. Sorry if I butchered that name. I'm just a terrible reader. We're going to be talking about economic modeling. We're going to be talking mainly about the pandemic. So the last 4 years and how did, the big models on the planet, the DSGE models, i.e. the New York Fed model, the ECB model, handle, kind of being a predictive tool of where things were going to go when we shut down the economy, what was going to happen. We're going to compare it to my model, the MESSSi model by now Modern Macro Technologies, MESSSi standing for Macroeconomic System State Simulator. Anybody's curious. We're going to kind of compare the two, right? And we're going to talk a lot about equilibrium, and how a system dynamicist would approach equilibrium and how a traditional mainstream economist would approach equilibrium. We're going to talk about exogenous and endogenous variables, because that's going to be very important to coming up with some of the predictions that, the MESSSi model achieved. And we can just say right now, the New York Fed DSGE model did not achieve. So it's going to be fun. I think the whole goal of the episode is really why hasn't economics, adopted tools like system dynamics and maybe to a lesser degree agent-based modeling? Why are they stuck in their ways? And I think we can kind of bring out, that conversation by bringing on the man, the star of the show, Professor Steve Keen. Here he is.
Hi, guys. Oh, hi, Guy, as it happens in this particular case. It's a bit lonely without the other two, isn't it?
It is. It's It's like a household where all the children have gone off to college.
Just the adults coming out having a bit of a chat. Let's see how we do.
Yeah, yeah. Steve, first and foremost, how was your week?
Oh, just flat out. I'm actually in the UK evading tripping the Shenzhen visa. So the reason I'm not back at home in Amsterdam is simply visa requirements. So that's a bit crazy. I'm getting ready to fly off to the States next week, where I'm going to be presenting a paper criticizing a little bloke called William in a university called Yale, which is amusing because that's where William happens to have a job. So that's going to be good fun. And then a week in the US, I'll actually be in New York on July the 4th. It's not July the 4th, but that's the one they celebrate, isn't it? No, we're going to be there on November the 4th when the election occurs. So that should be rather amusing. And then back to back on the land of the civilized in Amsterdam for 3 weeks, and then back over. And I think I'm going to be visiting somebody in Vancouver in about 5 weeks' time. Some bloke called Haynes.
There might be some photographic evidence of that. We'll see.
Okay. Maybe some stuff that can't get recorded either. Yeah, but busy. I'm actually working on using Ravel to write a critique of Rachel Reeves's budget. And what I like, this is going to be an interesting contrast between what I'm doing with Ravel and what you're doing with Ravel. Because even though I invented the damn thing, I've never had a chance to push it anywhere near as far as you've done. So what I tend to do is what I call toy models that take a particular circumstance and compare one, like what I'm doing with Rachel Reeves, for example, is comparing a world in which low level funds is true versus the real world in which it's false. And then I can make that sort of comparison. But you've taken the app to the nth degree and pushed Ravel to the stage where it's now competitive what's used to model, well, more than competitive, what's used to model dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. And as you'd know, they use a program called Dynair, which is an extension of MATLAB. And if anybody knows anything about programming, it's a load of crap. It's an optimization routine rather than system dynamics, but it's going to be nice to see the comparison of what you've done with Messi. Have you explained the full name?
Yeah. So, I think for historical purposes, everybody here in the chat, we all know Doug from Applied MMT. I've been struggling. So I built this model over a 2-year period, and it had many, many names. I probably sent a few to Steve and said, look at new abbreviation I came up with. But I've struggled, and Doug already had a name kind of in his library of names. And MESSSi stands for macroeconomic system state simulator. Now, when he came up with that name, he had no idea really about system dynamics, and I'm still teaching him, but he's catching on. But when he said system state in it, I was like, bingo.
Yeah.
You know, system dynamics is about your different system states. So you could have a 5 system state model, a 10 system state model. And that's where all your information is stored in stocks. So all those flows accumulate in the stocks. And that represents the information of your model. It's like the brain, right? And they can be dimensioned in different things, whether it's dollars, people, man hours. It could represent anything, right? And so that's how you get your information. I.e., a DSGE model doesn't employ that. I've seen some where they've got a placeholder for capital, but it doesn't. That's not how they function. So when I saw system state, I was like, bingo. That is perfect. It is definitely a macro model. It's economics. And it is definitely a simulator. I think that's what got me into Minsky, is you could simulate with it. More so than the math, is you could literally run a simulation, pick different policies, and see what's actually happening. And I know there are people out there like me that get a really big kick out of that. So it was a perfect name. So that's why we are calling it that. Thank you for everybody being here in the chat. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the Prof. Steve Keen channel. If you're on Twitter X, hit that like button, retweet. And if you're on LinkedIn, do the same thing. Let's kind of take a look. I'll save Julia the work here. Let's bring up the DSGE model from the New York Fed. And this kind of highlighted 4 different stages of the DSG model from the New York Fed and its predictions. And so the first one in the upper left-hand corner has 2 plots, one for output and one for inflation. Output, they did pretty good. Inflation, well, you can't get any more worse than that. I would have actually given them I would have given them credit if they had an inverse of inflation there where there was massive deflation. At least their model would have thought something was happening, but they just assumed everything would be a-okay. You can go to the next plot, which is for December 2021. And they're still on it with output. They're doing pretty good. But inflation, this was the back when we started talking about transitory inflation. And they finally accounted. So if you look at the black line, and this is the plot in the very right-hand top corner, each time they make a release with the DSGE model, all they're doing is shocking it into a new equilibrium to match the data. And they'll do anything. They'll just start the data from that point and disregard how wrong they were in the past. But beyond the black line is the model's data. And so they pretty much failed there. They, right after the data ends and the prediction starts, they were saying it was going to go back to their equilibrium point of about 2% inflation within 9 months. So that's kind of a look at a DSG model. And of course, you got the 2022 and the 2023 predictions. Both of them for inflation, they failed as well. The 2023 one looks a little bit better. But after 2.5 years, you'd figure the millions of dollars they spend there, they could refine it to finally get it right. That's the type of modeling the best. This is one of the gold star DSG models employed by the New York Fed. The ECB has an even more complex one. It performed just the same. Basically, none of these models predicted any inflation, and when they did try to start modeling it, they were broadly wrong. And this kind of goes back to a lot of Steve's work. We noticed in 2008 that the DSG modeling paradigm was terrible. It didn't predict the great financial crisis. So from 2008 to 2020, a 12-year period, you'd figure, okay, the science of economics, there's going to be some breakthroughs. They're going to take a hard look at themselves. They're going to take a hard look at their modeling techniques, and things should change. That's a decade worth of time that they can change things. And, when I see modeling like we saw post-COVID during the lockdowns, it kind of tells me that they didn't really do a whole lot. So I can I'll bring up Ravel right now. Let's try to share my screen here. So this is, and we'll just make this big. We'll get rid of the chat. Yes, thank you, Julia. So, and Mike Radzicki's here. We'll bring him on. That's good. Great. Yeah. So, we'll before we bring him on, we'll do our little thing with him. We'll just take a look at the Messi model. And so I'll tell you, everybody, how we approach this, because there is the benefit for hindsight for us. We kind of modeled this after the pandemic, whereas, the people at the Fed running the DSG model didn't have that, hindsight perspective. So what we did when Doug and Adam and I sat down is we decided, okay, we're going to kind of go back to January 2020, and we're going to react to each period. And we're just going to start putting in the shocks that we think were happening in that moment and let the model go. And so that's how we did this. We tried to do it as scientifically as we could. And so this is the results. We could have optimized this to almost be perfect, but we wanted to use this as a predictive tool. So we had to behave like we were in the moment applying the shocks. And the first part of the pandemic, and DSG models don't use capital utilization shocks per se. They prefer to go to what are productivity shocks, consumer preferences shocks, firm maximization shocks, basically a bunch of micro foundation bullshit. We kind of decided, okay, no, there's something else here, and it's right to the point. Factories are getting shut down, equipment's not being used. This is the shock that we're facing. So that's what we applied. Now, if you look at the start on the left-hand graph, which is inflation, we issued our last shock, and I think might have been late 2020, early 2021. We didn't issue any shocks for about another year and a half after that. And the model predicted that inflation, right? We didn't do it. That was what I said at the beginning of the show. We're going to discuss exogenous and endogenous behavior. So we did our exogenous shocks in 2020. And then in 2021, 2022, the model's actually just giving us the endogenous behavior. And that's something a DSGE model can't do unless you bake it in somehow, right? And of course, you would have to, basically, toss out all the neoclassical assumptions to ever make a DSGE model work to any good degree. So that's kind of how we approached it. We were very happy. We're pretty happy with real GDP compared to the real data. Just to let everybody know, the blue line, the Fred data, that is the empirical data from the Federal Reserve economic database from the St. Louis Fed. So that's a comparative of the model and the real world data. Ultimately, I'll take this down if I can. Stop sharing. I do this all myself. Ultimately, we've already got it developed. We have an AI deep learning tool and an AI language tool. So right in our interface, we have a language tool. So the model will communicate to the language model. So you can interact with an AI bot and ask the bot, what's going on? What am I seeing in the model right now? Why? We also have deep learning. So the deep learning model is going to optimize this model. So we're going to do a release every month on applied MNT for our retail members. And we're going to give them, our macro predictions. And the model's going to optimize, all the parameters. There's a couple hundred parameters to optimize, right? And it's going to learn. And how it's learning right now is what I'm doing, to create this shock. And that's why I go back. The pandemic is a wealth of economic information for us going forward on how the economy actually behaves, because we put a lot of extreme shocks. This wasn't, excessive debt or a productivity shock. This was shutting down the economy, a huge portion of it, right? And then snapping it back on in increments, right? An incredible shock to the economy that hopefully, a lot of detail will be written about it. But before I go any further, we got to bring on Mike. Mike Radzicki is in the house. Julia, bring him on. There's Mike.
Good to see you, Matt. Yep.
Yeah.
Hi.
Mike, what's going on?
Oh, sorry I'm late. I thought I'd get back here in time. I almost made it. I had to go to Boston this morning. We have a student projects, and this was the first meeting of the student team with the project sponsor. So I'm their advisor. So I had to go and get everything under control. And I looked at my watch and said, "Uh-oh, gotta go." I got here within 10 minutes. I thought I'd make it, but sorry. But here I am.
We definitely want you here to give us the systems and dynamic analysis of the MESSSi model, because that's. And I was really actually must say, Matt, I was very pleased with your comments on Ravel about 2 weeks ago, I think it was, when you said that the fact we could generate the equations to show what the actual differential equations were behind a model was an advantage that Ravel has that no other program in the field does. But what we've got with Ty's work here is the first attempt at in some ways it's a attempt to do what Forrester tried to do with Vensim, I think, to build a United States model. And a bit of history there would be very useful. I've got to tell, mate, just a moment here. I've sent you a link on email, so check the link. Okay. They're saying at a friend's place here at the moment. Yeah, so Forrester, when you look at where the system dynamics came from, a lot of it was, I'm going to give a second hand, you can get the first hand version here, was Forrester looking at economic modeling back in the 50s and being horrified at how bad it was. So in some ways, the impetus from system dynamics came from economics and its inadequacies. And then Forrester never, ever quite finished that model. Whereas what I think what Ty's done here may be what Forrester wished to do and never quite got there. So a bit of background from you, mate, would be good.
Sure. So so just real quickly, so Jay Forrester was an electrical engineer. He grew up on a ranch, a cattle ranch in Nebraska, and his parents thought he would be a rancher. But as a high school student, he said, hey, we need this thing called electricity on our ranch. So he went to a junkyard, got all the stuff, and electrified his parents' ranch. They said, yeah, you're probably not going to be a rancher. So they sent him to the University of Nebraska. He studied electrical engineering, impressed the faculty. They said, you should go to grad school. His mother had grown up in Massachusetts and heard about this place called MIT. So he said, okay, I'll go there. So in 1939, he went to MIT. He went into Gordon Brown's servo mechanism lab. Gordon Brown retired as dean of engineering at MIT, but at that time he was running a servo mechanism lab, and they were doing work for the Navy, basically radar and guns on battleships to defend the ship. So they did a whole bunch of servo stuff, and Jay used to talk about going to fix the servos on the aircraft carrier Lexington during World War II, and he wasn't finished, so he had to go out to sea, and they got torpedoed and all this crazy stuff. He comes back, and the Navy says, you did a nice job for us. How about you build us a computer so that pilots can train in a simulator, which was a new idea in 1946. He said, sure. They tried analog computers to begin with. That didn't really work. So they said, let's build a digital computer. So Forrester led the team that built MIT's first general purpose digital computer. It's called Whirlwind 1. Part of it is in the Smithsonian Institution. Part of it is in the Computer Museum in Boston. He invented magnetic core storage during a time, which is the way that all digital computers configured their primary memory until the silicon chip days of the 80s. The government came back and said, great, can you do another one for us? Can you link a bunch of whirlwinds together and defend the United States from Soviet attack during the Cold War? And the answer is yeah. So he led a team with Bob Everett. They created the SAGE air missile defense system for the U.S. When that was ready for commercialization, they spun that off to MITRE Corporation, and Bob Everett stayed with it. And Jay was going to leave and start a business, and the president of MIT said, no, please don't leave. Is there anything we can do around here that would interest you? And Forrester said, the biggest impediment to human progress is not from physical systems. It's from social systems. Because he worked managing people in these big projects. And he said, that's the key. So they sent him over to the business school at MIT and said, figure out how to do something to make social systems better, corporate systems. And he was assigned, the first year he said, all I had to do to get my salary was think. And he was given 3 helpers. And they were graduate students in economics. After the first year, he dismissed them. He said they didn't think like engineers. And he replaced them with 3 electrical engineering graduate students. And together they created what we know as system dynamics. Now, Jay, during the years of developing computers, said we documented everything so that there would be we knew we were creating a new field. So we wanted to, have a record of what we did, what worked, what didn't, whatever. So Jay created the D-Memo series in the system dynamics group, and they documented everything. D is for document. So D-0000 is the first paper in our field, 1956. And Steve is absolutely right. Jay investigated the economic modeling of that era, the mid-1950s. And you can tell that he was trying to be polite, but he kept saying like, well, I'm new to the area, I'm an engineer, but your stuff sucks. And then he goes, here's how you should do it. And he basically described system dynamics. Now it's unpublished to this day, so it didn't really make a splash in the field of economics. So from the mid 50s to the late 60s, he was working on corporate modeling. And what they did, they go into a corporate, they got out from behind their desks and they would ask people, what do you do around here all day? And they could tell you because they do it all day. And they found that the marketing people did stuff that made absolute sense. The shop floor guy did everything that makes sense and so forth. But then when you hooked it all together, you had bad behavior. And then you had a vehicle for testing. What if we redesign the corporation this way, the airplane this way? What if we redesign the airplane, the corporation that way? 68 rather, the former mayor of Boston is given a position at MIT as a professor of urban planning. You know, politicians do a year or two at a think tank or something. And by chance, John Collins, the former mayor of Boston, was given an office next to Jay. And John Collins said, what do you do around here? I build computer models. And Jay explained it. And Collins said, well, if you can build a computer model of a corporation, can you build a computer model of a city? And Jay said, well, yeah, but I'd have to talk to the fire chief, the police chief, the head of the school system, and whatever. Collins said, when do you want him here? He said, no, I got to talk to him a lot, like every Wednesday, half a day for a semester. And Collins said, done. So Jay built the first computer model of a city, wrote it up in a book called Urban Dynamics, and he got the attention of the economics profession, at least the people that were into urban and regional economics. The book was a bit controversial. I won't get into why at the moment here. Then he attracted the attention from urban dynamics by a man named Aurelio Piche. Now, Piche was a very successful Italian businessman. During World War II, he led the Italian underground resistance to Mussolini, very big cheese in Italy. And he had created an organization called the Club of Rome during the 1960s. And the Club of Rome was devoted to the world problematique, or the predicament of mankind, which was you had the exponential growth of the world's population. And along with that, the exponential chewing up of resources and the exponential generation of pollution. And this was going to be a problem, thought Piche. So he said, we created this club to try and alert the world. And we would call, by the way, we call this today sustainable development. And everybody was polite, but nothing happened. So he heard about Jay's stuff and he said, can you model the world problematique? Jay did, wrote it up in a book called World Dynamics, and it became an international bestseller. Now the economists paid attention big time because now he's macroeconomics. And not only was he an engineer doing economics using tools that economists didn't develop, but a lot of his results contradicted the conventional wisdom of the economics profession. So they went after Jay hammer and tongs. And this is people like Nordhaus, right? And so what did Jay and the other system dynamics people conclude? And they were all coming from electrical engineering and management, not from economics. Economists don't like system dynamics. They don't understand it, they don't use it, and they don't like it. Now we're in the 70s, and guess what? Here's a long-winded way to get to Steve's question. Jay's like, okay, you economists are telling me I don't know what I'm doing. And guess what? We have stagflation, and you can't really explain it. You didn't predict it. So Jay got some funding and decided to build a system dynamics national model, a macro model based on system dynamics. And so he and his students began to do that and began to publish papers and what have you. Now, one of the interesting things that happened was the model generated, and still does, generates exponential growth. That's the trend. It generated a business cycle. There was noise. It was a stochastic model. They could turn noise on and off. But then it also generated this long economic cycle. So Jay said, we've made a mistake. Something's wrong here. There's no such thing. So they all stopped. He said, the economists are going after us. So we got to make sure this thing is tight, right? We can't have a plus sign that was supposed to be a minus sign somewhere and we get this weird behavior because they're going to come after us. All stop. And they tore the model apart. Thousands of equations, simulated everything in isolation. Conclusion. No, we're modeling what we're seeing. And this long wave thing is interesting. Is the model telling us something we didn't know? So he dispatches the graduate students to the Dewey Library with the task, find out if there's any record of an economic long wave. And lo and behold, they found evidence, papers by a Russian economist, Nikolai Kondratiev, who found such a long wave in the data for numerous Western market economies. And Kondratiev rose very high in the Soviet hierarchy of science because, of course, the Stalin and so forth were saying, see, these wicked capitalist countries have these terrible downturns, and Mother Russia, a communist nation, doesn't. Then Kondratiev made the mistake of saying, I think I see the same pattern in Russian data. He was banished to the Gulag, tried and executed by firing squad, and all of his work was removed from the annals of Russian science. So the Kondratiev cycle work is not well known, certainly not in the West. And he wrote in Russian, so you didn't read Russian. But they found it. So what Jay's model was kind of implying was that that the Great Depression, for example, was not a one-off anomalous behavior, but capitalist systems have multiple cycles, including this long sort of wave and they sort of correlated it with technological changes and stuff like that. And one of the things that Kondratiev never did was to explain why he was finding these things in data. There's no theory or whatever, but Jay's model provided a theory. In the model, it's a feedback thing. There's a self-reinforcing feedback loop that plant and equipment is made by plant and equipment. It's a capital self-ordering loop. So the capital sector has to make capital for the other sectors and for itself. And you get this big amplification in the system. So actually, because of Jay's work, Kondratiev's name was restored in the annals of Russian science, and Kondratiev's heirs wrote Jay a letter thanking him for restoring their great-grandfather's name and all that stuff. So why don't we have this model here today? I'll wrap up here. Long-winded answer, but big picture. Well, right when all this was happening, remember I said he was putting Gordon Brown's servo mechanism lab in 1939, and he went on to be Dean of Engineering. Well, he retired to Phoenix, Arizona, right when the Macintosh came out, Stella came out, not Minsky, sorry. And Jay, as a gift to his former mentor, presented him with a Mac and with the software. And Gordon Brown, being retired, clever, and bored apparently, walked over to his local middle school with that. Said, knock, knock. I'm the former Dean of Engineering at MIT. Can I talk to your principal? They let him in. He talked to the principal and he said, I got this thing. Give me some good teachers. So he met with, I think it was 3 teachers from different disciplines. And he said, here, I'm coming back in a month. Do something with this. And they did. And they created K through 12 system dynamics. And Jay concluded from that you shouldn't have to wait till you're a graduate student at MIT to learn system dynamics. Young kids can learn it. So that created the whole area of K through 12 system dynamics. So Jay stopped his work on the national model and said, I'm devoting the rest of my life to the young people because that's more important than battling with these economists. So on his deathbed, 2016, Jay was talking to Bob Eberlein and Khalid Saeed. They both taught for us. And he said, you guys can have my model and do something with it. And they've been looking at it and they're like, they can't understand a lot of Jay's equations. So they're like, it's kind of hard to get inside his head sometimes and see what he was thinking. So to publish it might be a little bit of a stretch. So they're thinking about doing something with the model, but I don't know that they've reached a decision on what to do yet. One other thing, and I'll leave it with this, is another thing that caused Jay's model to be delayed was advances in software. So every time the folks at Vensim, primarily at the time, would get a new software tool that would allow you to diagnose something in a model. For example, they had reality checks, for example, or a checker to check the dimensionality of all your equations. They would say, oh, let's try it on the national model. And it would uncover a bunch of problems. And Jay would say, I'll stop. the economists are going to come after us. So we got to make sure we tighten up whatever the issue was. And that with a large model took quite some time. So there are a couple of things that prevented the model from ever being published. It was actually written up a couple times in a 2-volume set, the model and then companion papers and stuff. And Jay was never happy. And so never put them out for publication. And then he passed away in 2016. So I'll leave it there.
There is actually a really nice video on YouTube. I can't remember where he was presenting the model, but he gave an hour-long talk of the rundown of the model. And it's so anybody out there, if next time you're on YouTube, don't leave the show now because we'll watch us. But just type in J. Forrester National Model, and it'll come up with a couple talks where he gives some insights. And there is a few, like I found, I don't know, about 15 papers in my research on it, but nothing in depth. I'd love to get my hands on the equations. Even if I didn't know what they meant, I'd love to look at them. Steve, I want to kind of, because we got the picture of what system dynamics is from Mike there and the history of J. Forrester's national model. Steve, I want you to contrast it because, you know, what we're talking about today is system dynamics as opposed to DSGE modeling. And I would kind of want you to talk about the failings of DSGE modeling because, well, you've done a lot of research into that. So maybe kind of highlight some of the pitfalls of taking that approach.
Well, the DSGE modeling was really a manifestation of the neoclassicals' belief that you had to derive macro from micro. And of course, the micro we're using was neoclassical micro. Now, I've spent a huge part of debunking economics pointing out that neoclassical micro is garbage. None of it actually works for all sorts of reasons. So, for example, the argument of a rising supply curve, which is essential to micro, assumes diminishing marginal productivity. You do empirical research into firms and find firms don't suffer from diminishing marginal productivity. They design factories so they reach maximum efficiency at maximum output. If anything, you've got rising marginal productivity, not falling. So you don't get a rising marginal cost curve. You don't get the actual basics of micro. Then they try to represent individuals using indifference curves. And even if you get individuals and give them a trivial number of commodities to consider, like, for example, 8, and you then try to model their behavior and fit it into what's called the axioms of revealed preference, you find they contradict those axioms. The reason being the dimensionality of the number of combinations of things you can buy, even when you only get 8 commodities, is so enormous, it overwhelms our processing power. So people don't think that way. They think in habit, and they use habit, and their social capacity to buy determines far more than what they do than the idea of neoclassical immaculate conception of indifference curves. And on top of that, complex systems has taught us you can't derive a higher level model from a lower level foundation. And the conceit that economists have is that you have to derive macro, which is a higher level, from micro, which is the foundation level. Now, that if you apply that to biology, you would say that biology is applied chemistry. So the most important question in biology is what chemicals are necessary to create life. If that was biology, there'd be no biology. So what was argued by Philip Anderson, a Nobel Prize winner in physics and therefore a real Nobel Prize, back in '63, he made the comment that more is different. And when you get to the stage of aggregations, even of elementary particles like, for example, H2O, large combination of H2O, the behavior you get out of it can't be derived by extrapolating the behavior of individual molecules of H2O. You have emergent properties. So the neoclassicals have no knowledge of that, no understanding of it, but they're trying to derive everything from micro. So what they found, this is talking about, originally there was Sargent and Lucas and Sargent who pushed what they call the micro foundations critique of macro, and the idea that what's called the Lucas critique, which people still take seriously. It's got some merit, but saying that when you change the parameters of the model, people's behavior will change to reflect that. But what they assume, and this is the crazy part of it, is that everybody has a model of the model in their head, which is accurate, and therefore people behave according to the model, and therefore they cancel any attempt by anybody outside the model to control their behavior, and therefore government policy can't work. That's the essence of the Lucas critique. But what you get in the real world is, of course, people are adapting all the time, but they're adapting with their own limited knowledge of the system which they have. Nobody has a model of the entire system in their head. So all the foundations they have in DSGE modeling are wrong in the fact that they assume that individual agents within the model have a model of the model in their brain, which is accurate. Nonsense stuff like that. Anyway, so they have on the initial model comes from a guy called not the first name is Arthur, Frank Ramsey. And Frank Ramsey was a polymath in the early 20s, a true genius. And he was mathematically gifted, and he attempted to solve the question of what is the optimal savings rate for a society. And to do that, what he imagined was a single set of indifference curves, preferences, determining behavior. So you don't have any social conflict. We all have what's called a utility map can describe the entire economy. Then you assume there was a single firm, which is profit maximizing, which is according to the concepts of marginal cost and marginal revenue, et cetera, et cetera. Very complicated mathematics, very sophisticated. But what it ended up with is a two-system state model, one involving the rate of growth of consumption over time, and one involving the ratio of capital to labor. And what you wanted is a stable capital labor ratio and a growing consumption rate over time, but that growing at a constant rate. So the intersection of those two dynamic systems, he literally called it the point of bliss. Okay, so there's a future point of bliss you wish to reach. How do you get there? Now, the bliss point having two equations to it, capital and the capital to labor ratio, which you want to reach an equilibrium. So it's constant capital labor ratio, but growing capital and growing labor over time. And then this consumption growing at a constant rate. That ended up having a saddle node equilibrium. So anybody in dynamics, and Mike, you can dive in here and elaborate better than I'll do, but a saddle, if you have a two-dimensional system which has a saddle, according to a mathematician, that's unstable. Because if you imagine you're trying to reach the saddle, you have let's say you got a tennis ball, and you're trying to throw the tennis ball so it lands on the back of a horse, on the saddle on a horse. What are your chances of doing that? Roughly zero, okay? You'd have to be standing precisely in front of the horse. You throw the ball so it just lands on the saddle and it rocks up and down the spine of the horse and doesn't deviate off the side. Bullshit chance of doing it. But what Ramsey presumed was there's a social planner who can work out the orientation of the saddle in the future, the point of bliss. You then extrapolate back along the only position on which you could throw the ball and land on the saddle. That's the stable, what's called eigenvector. For those who don't know it, that's the direction in which the horse is pointing fundamentally. And that, if you get it on that axis and only on that axis, then the ball will ultimately come to rest at the bottom of the saddle on top of the horse. Now, what Ramsey presumed was a social planner could work that out and extrapolate it back to the current time. And back at the current time, that would tell you what ratio of investment to consumption is necessary to reach the future point of bliss. That's what the mathematics of Ramsey's paper was. Now, that in itself is crazy enough in some ways as saying, how should you determine the level of consumption now? But what it meant was you could have a jump, as they called it, between consumption and investment. So consumption could jump up or down, rise or fall, and that then would mean you move from a point that's not pointing at the horse's nose to a point that is pointing at the horse's nose, and then in the future you'll reach that future point. So I think it was Kidlin and Prescott who discovered this paper by Ramsey. They originally looked at Solow's work on Solow's growth model, but Solow didn't have the utility side of the argument inside the argument. Ramsey's work was more sophisticated, utility and also investment and capital output. And they said, we can use this as a foundation for DSGE. I'll shut up for a second, let Mike dive in here. But that's the foundation of the models.
Yeah, that's pretty good summary. I think also Phelps's contribution when he built the model of Solovia, the mythical nation of Solovia, named after Robert Solow.
Yeah.
And it was the golden rule of accumulation, right? And I think it reaches the same bliss point as in in the Ramsey model without going through the, sort of the gymnastics you just described. But of course, then you get into where he's maximizing per capita consumption spending, and that would is that really bliss or maximum utility, maximizing per capita stuff and what have you. But that was also a interesting contribution.
But what you got was they built dynamic. The first of all, they built what they called real business cycle models, and then what the real business cycle models argued was that everybody in the society who's rational, and rational means, of course, you have an economic model in your head, which is the same as the real system, which is a neoclassical model where you have utility maximizing consumers and profit maximizing firms, and the market reaches equilibrium. So therefore, you can work out where this bliss point is. And there's ever a shock, what the shock does is changes where the horse is pointing. Okay, this is in the far future. Imagine a saddle on a horse, and there's some shock, they call it shocks to technology and preferences, because all the model had as a foundation was the preferences of consumers and the technology that linked labor and capital to reduce output. So there'd be a shock to one or the other that would change the orientation of the horse and the location of the horse in the far future. We would then all rationally work out where that meant the horse was pointing. We'd then find where that point intersected between you have your output is between zero. If all of output is part of it is consumption, the other part of investment. So you get a point somewhere in this range, and that's the new point you jump to. So consumption jumps. I think they call it an Euler equation they use for consumption, insulting another great mathematician.
Consumption is the Euler's equation, and it drives me.
So, or the volatility in the stock market, in the capitalist economy that they explain in DSGE models is volatility of consumption, not volatility of investment. Whereas the Keynesian approach, which is none of this shit is involved, argues that volatility, fundamentally investment is the volatile component, not consumption. So they flip that over, and then they try to estimate the actual data. But to do it, they've got to throw all sorts of shocks in the system, random shocks to technology, random shocks to consumption, and then that's what they use to fit the data. They actually change the scale of the shocks they hit to the underlying model. And the underlying model on the real business cycle model systems had a single consumer who was a single producer who worked for a single firm, which worked in perfect competition, of which he was an employer and the boss, so that he got the wages and the profits from the system and tried to maximize utility over the entire time period. And the role of the model was to use backward iterated utility maximizing concepts to say you'd move to this equilibrium point, or the equilibrium vector. Okay, so rather than talking about what we used to be called computable general equilibrium models, which were models of production now as using input-output dynamics, where they presumed all markets were in equilibrium at a point in time, and that meant the input of one market was the output of one market was input to another, and so on. So you had to get computable general equilibrium in the production system. They threw that all away. Rather than having multi-commodity, you've now got a single commodity. And therefore, what you've got is a consumer producer trying to optimize consumption and profit maximization through time. That became the basis of the RBC models.
So I think the way I teach this history, and Steve is not wrong, but the way I sort of big picture try and teach this stuff, this is just my views on it. Macroeconomics was created by Keynes in 1936, but it really didn't get going until after World War II, right? So after World War II, and we had all these war-torn economies that had to be rebuilt and what have you, we kicked off the Keynesian revolution and macroeconomics. And for the first couple of decades, the idea was that an economy is unstable, business cycles, and needs to be controlled or stabilized. And the government would do that with its budget, right? That's in a nutshell the message. And I think today we see the dispute in the United States anyway with the Congressional Budget Office. They have static versus dynamic scoring, and what that means is the Lucas critique that, what Lucas's point was that, hey, when you take a macro model and estimate the parameters from historical data, those parameters will become invalid when there's a policy change, because rational producers and consumers will change their behavior in response to the government's action, its attempt to stabilize things, right? So that's the same thing in the Congress. When they mark up a bill in the Congress, it goes to the Congressional Budget Office, and they will use their models to estimate the cost or the benefits, the revenues, the spending or whatever of this bill. They use static scoring. They assume nobody changes their behavior in response to the policy change. And of course, the rational expectations people say that's wrong. You need to use dynamic scoring and say you raise the income tax rate, people are going to change their behavior, right? And the Congressional Budget Office says, well, we don't know how exactly they're going to change their behavior. So the safe thing to do is assume that the behavior will not be changed. So they use static scoring. But anyway, Lucas and his people then with the Lucas critique said, so your traditional Keynesian models where you're trying to stabilize an unstable system is wrong. They won't work because rational people will change their behavior. So then they had to offer an alternative way of doing modeling. So what they did was they switched the emphasis in macroeconomics from figuring out how to control or stabilize an unstable system, capitalist systems going down, to this chess game between the government bureaucrats and the producers and consumers with rational expectations. I'm going to run a budget deficit to stabilize the economy because we're in a downturn, but rational consumers will save more to pay the higher tax bill they know is coming later. And so they'll undermine the stimulus effect of the deficit spending. So it's this chess game of expectations that's going on, almost like game theory, rather than using macro modeling to control an unstable system.
But within the framework,
they had to offer models that could represent this other way of thinking about it, and they get into this whole real business cycle thing, and
that's inherently including loanable funds and leaving out money. They call them real business cycle. They didn't have the money in the system at all. But fundamentally, the whole modeling framework was one in which there was no money creation. Government, if it borrowed money, had to pay it back in the future. And aggregate tax bill had to equal aggregate spending over time, and so on and so forth. And it left out, of course, it leaves out credit, which is an essential part of the way that I think about a capitalist economy. It left out government money creation as well, or it said government has to come back to zero. And some of the stuff and this stuff, you basically, I think, look, I live in Amsterdam and I can't find dope that good in Amsterdam for some of the ideas they come up with. One of my favorites is a guy called, hang on, just had the name on the tip of my tongue and it's disappeared. But he developed what's called the Ricardian equivalence principle.
Robert Barrow. That's
Barrow,
yeah.
He was a real right winger, and he apparently he had a villa in Italy, and he couldn't stand the fact that he couldn't get the workers on time. So he was actually trying to destroy the trade union movement, and he developed this idea of rational. What he called Ricardian equivalence. And that explains why if you increase taxes now, if you increase spending now, people will spend less because they know they've got to save money to pay taxes in the future. And then he was challenged on that. Now, this is one of my favorite, what rubbish can what do you want and where do you get it type thinking. He's challenged by people who said, well, yes, okay, we accept that arrangement, but what if someone rationally expects the taxation that's necessary to pay for the extra spending over taxation now to occur after they died? We've got you. And he said, oh, no, you haven't, because rational people will give to their future generations wait for it, altruism. So they drag in altruism as a fundamental element of neoclassical. Give me a fucking break. It's all about self-interest. The whole idea that, he literally said, this argument fails if current generations give to future generations out of altruism. And therefore, an individual family behaves as if it's a dynasty that lives forever and is optimizing its utility over the infinite future. Now, that is what lies behind these bloody the RBC models, real business cycle models. And then the thing is, that was so effing crazy that even crazies like Krugman and Oliver Blanchard and so on, that the modern neoclassicals couldn't cope with that. They said, oh, that's too extreme, because that even implies that unemployment during the Great Depression was voluntary. Okay, workers decided to go on an extended holiday because there were changes to labour market relations that made it more desirable to have leisure than it was to work. That's what caused the unemployment during the Great Depression. If anybody thinks I'm making that up, search for a paper by a guy called Edward Prescott, and it's called Some Observations on the Great Depression. And he literally explains the decrease in employment during the Great Depression as an increase in workers' leisure.
Well, Steve, of course, they won the Nobel Prize for that work. So how can you?
I know exactly. Yeah. So
all right.
Let's get into Messi. Let's get away from this shit into Messi.
Steve's actually, as I was listening to all this stuff, you guys are incredibly smart and thankfully, in my opinion, on the right side of history when it comes to economic thought. A lot of the conversation has nothing to do with the real world. Like I talked to a bunch of finance guys that are trying to figure out the markets. None of these conversations come into play. They're just fictions of philosophers from economics. But I won't go into that, but I will get Steve to do the top chatter list because it's your turn. Julia, bring it up for us. No, you better take my name down too.
Okay. Well, I'm going to throw in a mate's note. I'm at a mate's place right now. I think he called himself Elder Mama on when he was on Twitter, but he's jumped off there now, so I'm going to put him in the list. He's sitting over there trying to work while I'm chatting in the back of the room here. G'day, Rex. Okay, here we go. Tony Wilson, Ghost on the Half Shell. Ogham the Bowl, that's a new one. The Herald of Change, Dreg Eye, Economics in One Lesson, Algo Rhythm, Sherry Wise, Marco de Souza Cruz, Ratulus, another new one. Shote, David Collins, Zoe Lindsay, hi Zoe, TR, The Hasty Ent, Michael de Souza Cruz, what are you doing there twice, Michael? Mangala Raj, Zargo 5, Paul Traynor BSC, Rip the Jacker, okay, Marie, Mag, Adam, David Sullivan, Kikluri Economies, we've got to get the translation of that later, Andrew Carey, Connor Howell, Paul Smith, Toby, Spit and Feathers, Jupiter, Toby Veal, Owen Wall, Michael Newman, Bill Sticker, Bob Liore, hello Bob, Thomas Darlington, Andrew Baker, Gwenham, Andrew Carey, William Branch, Randy Osborne, Jen Ziddick, Web Freaks, and D. Smith.
Yeah, I don't have sound effects. Yeah. Woo, yeah.
I think Lori Economics is circular economy or circular economics.
That might be. I think that's it. That sounds right. Yeah. So that's why the DSGE models didn't see the crisis coming, because they didn't have the causal factors in the crisis behind it. They left out the financial system. They assume loanable funds without even discussing it, because they don't even include the banking system or private debt or credit in their own models. And therefore, when the financial crisis hit in 2008, all these DSGE models, and the leading one was by Smets and Wouters at the time, I think that's the basis of the ECB's model. That was seen as the ants pants model at the time, and it fitted the data beautifully. And then the crisis came along, and the model goes one way and the data goes the other, because they're leaving out the causal factors in the economy that come from the finance sector as well as realism.
Exactly.
Yeah, we have a checklist in system dynamics of things that allow us to quote unquote build confidence in a model. We never talk about a model being valid or invalid, sort of like, up, down, black, white, valid, invalid, but rather, can we build confidence in our model that it's telling us something we should believe? And there's a whole battery of tests. One of the weakest tests is fitting the model to data. Okay. Because, as you know, if you have enough levers and buttons and dials, you can torture your model to fit a data set to almost any degree of complexity. The mathematicians say a polynomial of enough higher order can be fit to any data set. So it's a rather weak test, as Steve is kind of saying. So, now, going the other way, if no matter how you hammer on your model, you can't make it look anything like a data set, then that tells you something. But going the other way, just because you can make it look like the real data doesn't mean anything. You have to look at other aspects of the model to build confidence in it.
And if anybody wants to get a bit of background from a neoclassical on this point, search out the paper called The Problem with Macroeconomics by Paul Romer, because he goes through all this stuff and from a neoclassical point of view, and says how it's been a complete failure. He wrote that paper in 2016. It was supposed to be a major paper in a an overview journal, like the Journal of Economic Perspectives and that sort of thing. It's never been published. He's still got it on the web, but it basically, he satirizes all this stuff and says fundamentally the models are thought of things like gremlins and phlogiston and all these shocks are totally arbitrary. They've got nothing to do with the real world. So what they do is they overfit the data, and they often fit it by changing the shocks, the magnitude of the shocks over time to make the thing fit the data. They get a perfect fit, and then they can't predict the future. And that they never go back and do what meteorologists do and saying, well, your model's better than my model for predicting this particular part of the planet. Let's see if we can compare and see what's different about your model and my model. And physicists do the same thing. So the extent to which economists don't do the basic quality control you're talking about, Mike, is just terrific.
Yeah. So this is actually, it's interesting you guys bring this up, because this is so we're planning to have deep learning, change parameters in the model. Of course, the big problem is like Mike said, you can jam all your policy parameters to anything you want, and over a select time period, you can fit the data. You run into problems when you extend the time period and it doesn't work later on. So you have to, there has to be some sort of human intervention or some, theoretical discussion on, okay, if I'm going to fit the data and introduce shocks to a model, are these shocks actually based in reality? Like, are they real? So one of the, and I'll bring up the model here in a second, one of the, issues and discussions we're having right now was the persistent inflation from 2023 to about 2024. It is now starting to drop. What was the cause of that? Now, I put my mainstream economist hat on, and I decided, okay, so we had figured out the shocks to at the beginning of the pandemic. It's quite simple: capital utilization shocks, right? The capital utilization was reduced, and it gave us the results we wanted. But we couldn't figure out in the model, inflation just keeps on dropping, but it was sustained for about a year, around 2.5%. And so I went and, did the mainstream thing. And I said, you know what, this has got to be a productivity shock. So I put the productivity shock into the model, and it held inflation, at around 2.5% for about a year. And I was like, I got it. Everything's figured out. Doug comes along and he's like, yeah, but I'm looking at the productivity data on Fred and there is no shocks. And so I look at the model, because we can look at every variable in the model, and lo and behold, my productivity in the model does not match the productivity shape of 2023. So I took that out. And so the model, it starts giving an inaccurate inflation reading again. But when I looked at the productivity level, it was shaped exactly the same as what we were seeing in the real economy. And that kind of goes to, you can jam any lever you want, and bam, you've got your accurate model, but you apply that in the future to another situation, it's not going to work, right? We have solved the problem. We think we have the reason behind it. And I guess I'll bring up the model here and we'll play with it, because this is the fun part, is kind of testing some scenarios. So we've done some changes. I put up a graphic at the beginning of the show that actually the back half of inflation, when you look at it, it levels off just like it did in reality. But I had done that through a series of productivity shocks, and I've come to learn, and Doug really hammered it home, I was wrong, and I was thinking like an economist, and I don't want to do that. So what we did in the first half, we see these, drop in inflation. We see a drop in real output. We see a shoot up in unemployment. The first part of the run is a series of capital utilization shocks. And what gets really interesting and what gives us a degree of confidence in our model is because we stopped our last shock in just the very end of 2020. And we introduced no shocks until early 2022, so a full year. And our model replicated exactly what output was, almost exactly what inflation was, and unemployment. And then on the back half, the story has actually become a story of markup. So this kind of goes to Isabella Weber's, postulates that, big firms, big corporations are being rather greedy with their markups on prices right now. But we wanted to know, why are they being greedy on their markups? One of the theories we're kind of developing. So right now in the back half here, you'll see all these nice little squiggly lines. Those are actually individual markup shocks. So we've forced the model to mark up prices because we kind of looked at corporate profit data and we're really leaning heavily. That was the reason. But why were firms doing that? One of the things that was happening at the same time was rate increases. And so rate increases ultimately transmit into actual rates that firms are paying throughout the economy. It'll look a little different than the policy rate. Actually, I could bring it up. Let's, just for illustration, bring up this one, I think. Yes. So we'll go bank interest rate. So firms are paying, an interest rate generally always above the policy rate, and I'll come up in a second. And what firms have done during the period of rate increases, because it is a cost, it's a new cost to a firm when they're paying additional, is they were offsetting that cost with increasing their markups. So what we're doing right now is we're actually developing a function based on the bank interest rate, where it'll go into, we're thinking it's going to be in the shape of a logistic or a sigmoid. Whereas rates go up at lower rates, there's not much effect in firms marking up their prices. But when we get to like 3, 4, 5, and 6%, firms start marking up their prices. And it might be a good theory of why we saw a level off of inflation over the last, from 2023 into 2024, and now it's starting to decline. So that's kind of, how we approach, instead of just, forcing something to fit the data, we want to kind of go down the theoretical framework of causal reality. And that's why I know Mike will agree. That's why system dynamics is really great, because if you do build a system that you're fairly confident represents reality, then you can kind of start going down those causal chains, looking at all your feedback loops and deciding, okay, what we're seeing here, can we theoretically postulate, and in this situation, that rates going up is an additional cost for firms, and firms are going to want to offset that cost and pass it on to consumers. It might seem pretty plausible. And there are papers out there that confirm that.
Now, I want to go some of the causal stuff, Kate, because this is showing the results of the model. This is because I can tell this is not coming out of Ravel itself. This is coming out of a Python addition you've made to Ravel. But can you go back and take a look at some of the causal relations you've got in the Ravel model itself, and then talk about what you've done, obviously, to extend it? Because I think what you're doing, as I can guess, is you're running multiple instances of Minsky in a Python wrapper, and then getting the results coming out in Python, and using Python for the AI. Is that correct?
So no, what we did is basically, so I use Minsky. I'll just take this down for a second because I like to look at myself because I'm so pretty. So hold on. Here we go. We can put up the chat bar again there, Julia. So what we did,
I had a parakeet that used to like to look at itself in its little mirror too. Anyway,
had similar head and fly, didn't it? Same sort of type. It's a parakeet. Got him now. Okay.
So what we did is originally we were going to try to use the back end of Minsky, one of the open source versions, because it's open source. We could do that, and you guys couldn't sue us. But we realized when there was a transition to Java for the front end, and we weren't really sure on the TLC or TCL coding.
TLC, yeah.
Yeah, so we decided, okay, Vincem, Minsky, now Ravel, Simulink, Stella, they're all great design canvases, each with their own separate applications, and you need them to build these complex systems. or else you can't do line code and build a big system dynamic model. You need to have that visual representation, so you see your causal loops. So it was all built in Ravel. And what we ultimately decided to do was just code it directly in Python, all the equations, and then we built some. Yeah,
You generated the actual relationships in Ravel, and then you recoded them in Python.
Yeah, so the great thing with Ravel is you can just look at your source file and an XML file. And another great thing with Ravel is you can also produce a LaTeX document with all of your equations in LaTeX.
Yeah.
And because, us new generation people, we actually use AI to our benefit. We just tell AI, convert those equations into a Python representation. And that's a little more complicated than that. It's been months of work. But because Minsky was giving us all that raw data, we were able to quickly convert it into a rough Python code. And then we've wrapped it in a couple different that chat thing keeps coming up. We've wrapped it into a couple different kind of applications. One will be a web application, so people can use a sandbox version of the model, so they can just play around with the dials. And this is kind of like the En-ROADS thing. So you can move a dial, see how your business cycles change. It's by no means going to be quantitative. It's just going to be a qualitative, heterodox view of the economy. And then we're going to have our kind of deep learning model that we'll publish to our retail subscribers, where it's going to show some macroeconomic predictions. And then we're going to have a full-fledged model that institutional customers can use. So they'll kind of get what you saw on screen. They can do the raw text entry, use their own like MESSSi model, change the assumptions if they want to. So basically, we're just trying to force out the DSGE models that are prevalent in big institutions still to this day, even though they probably don't get a lot of use. There's other applications. Sometimes it's just, instead of using one of those models, it's just better to draw a line straight through a bunch of dots and say linear regression. Here we go. Let's go into the future. So that's kind of where it's going to go. So that's how it was developed. At the end of the day, nobody like that wants to use this, technology like system dynamics or a national model. The people that are going to apply that to make money don't care about causal loop diagrams, right? That's for us geeks and academics. Right. In the real world, nobody cares about positive feedback. A little causal loop diagram, fine. Use that in a presentation. I do that, and in the last 3 I was in, I have a little causal loop diagram for each part of the economy. But people aren't interested in looking at Stella or Ravel or anything like that. That's an interest to the model designers, and it serves that purpose. But beyond that, they're more interested in just typing in a number, seeing the graphs, whether it's in a spreadsheet form or a plot form. That's what they really want.
But that's an intriguing bit of history there, because what's different about MESSSi, and this comes out of, is that it's based on system dynamics, which is basically systems of nonlinear differential equations, which the visual interface of system dynamics lets you build more easily than if you try to code them by hand. And that's what I used to do myself before I invented Minsky and then Ravel. So what I want to just do is a bit of background here and show what that gives you. And then the intriguing thing is you're using Ravel to generate the differential equations that you then put into Python, which you then put the AI wrappers and so on and make it into a commercial simulation system. That's very good.
Yeah. Well, unless you're Einstein, you need a visual interface like Minsky or Ravel, or in Mike's case, he uses Stellar. You need that as a systems designer. You really do. Like when your model becomes complex enough, it's really, it really becomes beneficial on understanding your own system as it grows. Because the bigger it gets, eventually, even the designer starts struggling. So it is a necessary tool. I could not have done this, 1, without godly tables, 2, without flowcharts. Could not have just conceived of the math. I needed to visually see how it's a wiring diagram. So you ask an electrical engineer, right? The person that uses a light switch does not give a flying fuck about the wiring diagram, but the electrician that designed the system, those are very critical to the design process, right? So there's use cases for each step of this. I'll bring up the national model in Ravel.
Yep.
I'll bring up. So even now today, and I'll share screen. So like I'd mentioned, I'm building a new function to dictate firm markups from interest rates. Do that in Minsky, because Minsky's really cool because it's a flight simulator system dynamic program.
Yeah.
So you can run it and then run it really, really slowly and adjust the parameters. And I always like that versus the other system dynamic software where it prints the whole run and then you slide the sliders and it just adjusts the whole run. I always liked it going in real time and making an adjustment at a certain point. Let's say if I'm looking at a variable that's high in its amplitude versus low in its amplitude, and right at that moment, I want to make an adjustment to one of the parameters affecting it. I always really like that. So I still use Minsky. That's the first thing I go to when I'm testing something new.
I'm going to dive in.
By the way, you can do all of that in Stella.
Spoil sport.
I think Stella's paying Mike some money in the background.
Actually, I'll just quickly before we do, bring up Go Meta with Ollie Sharp there, because Ollie's just done a superb YouTube video on my book, The New Economics of Manifesto. Anyway, let's take a look. Let's look at your model. This is it in Ravel. Let's roll.
Yeah, I just got to switch screens here. Let's go right to kind of what I was describing with the capital utilization shocks. So we have, a basic production function here. What it's saying is that there's a certain amount of real capital in the system, and there is a capital, output ratio, and that's going to give you your output. That's going to give you your employment. It's going to give you an employment ratio. What I was really varying in the pandemic run was this loop right here. And this part of the model, we can thank Steve's 1997 doctoral thesis paper, where he postulated that the capital utilization rate, what amount of capital of the total capital is used, is its primary endogenous kind of, determinant is employment itself. And I really like that. And when we run different like quantitative tests, seems to really kind of align with reality. So I implemented that in the later parts of the build. And that's what I'm really varying. That's, in my opinion, is the story of the pandemic, right? So we've got capital utilization, which is which affects real output, which affects labor, which affects the employment ratio, which is the inverse of unemployment. I feed that into a smoothing function because I need a stock in a loop. You can't have a loop. For anybody that's watching right now, we talk about causal loop diagrams. There has to be at least one stock, or you just basically have a chicken or the egg thing, right? So you need a piece of information. So the piece of information in this loop is a slightly lagged employment ratio, goes back into a logistic sigmoid type function that then dictates what the capital utilization rate is. Now, you might think, okay, well, I can just, change a variable in these blue parameters here for capital utilization, and that's my shock. But because this is a closed loop, you're going to have amplitude changes and frequency changes that feed back into each other, right? So just introducing one shock might have something temporally in one time, but a year down the road, something else is affected temporally. So that's kind of the big part of the pandemic. And just this part here, really, this is, I like to call can I back out here. Firm. If you're designing in Minsky, anybody, I know there's some Minsky users watching right now. Make sure you're bookmarking your huge canvas so you can quickly snap to wherever you go. What you're looking at here is what I like to call the Pentium processor of the model. Everybody knows I'm a huge Steve Keen fan. So I tried to put his DNA into this model, and this is just one part of the model, just to let you know, there's many other parts. But this is basically Steve's 1997 paper, and he's got other academic papers after that kind of give nuances to different details of this. But it's the Goodwin growth cycle model with the financial sector. And one of the things that Steve often doesn't do in his YouTube videos is add endogenous productivity, endogenous capital utilization. He did model it. He doesn't do it in his YouTube demonstrations, right? So you got to dig into his work a little bit. And I love digging into work. So close to the end, well, maybe about a year ago now, I fully read that paper. Steve, your master's was the Marx paper, right?
That's right. Yeah, the PhD was the one on Minsky.
Yeah, and that doesn't interest me. And that goes back to, that's just like economists and stuff talking about theory and stuff. So that didn't interest me. But the nuts and bolts to me is when Steve gets into mathematical modeling using system dynamics. I love that shit. So his doctoral thesis is all of that, right? Wrapped into one. Steve, in a different from what Steve does in his basic Goodwin models is he just assumes all output is consumed, and there's no legs in that. Obviously, with a large macro model, we have to actually assume the different components of consuming the raw goods. So you have, capitalists buying investment, capitals consuming, firms investing, households buying houses, households consuming, government spending, using up the resources, imports and exports, right? You have to factor all those in, the legs that you assume that exist. And that's kind of this little part here. And I know nobody's going to know what it means, but this little section that I'm circling is the inputs from the rest of the model. It really drives. This model is about investment, right? More so than consumption, which kind of goes back to what Steve was talking about, that investment is a volatile part of economics, and we need to model it. That's kind of, how this model's driven. There's lots of other parts. So I make sure, I did a household section, right? And so in this model, I asked myself, how can I build a national model that's going to give me data that I need to build something quantitative? Well, let's keep it to basics, and let's drop the consumption preferences and all the fake bullshit in economics. What does a household do? It buys capital goods, houses and cars, and it consumes. How does it do that? It's got a bank account. Okay, so how do they spend out of a bank account? Well, they spend until their money's gone. Simple as that, right? And when I put this model and I run actual real world tests on it, lo and behold, the results match. So I think sometimes, what's the term? Economists have physics envy. I think they really do when they build their DSGE models, and you look at the complicating equations, like the Euler's equation. So if you look at an Euler's equation and their difference equations, and you look at the right-hand side, you'll see a little superscript +1. So they're basically saying consumption is based on the knowledge of the future to the individual.
Yep.
I dropped all that shit because that is the biggest load of shit ever. And I realized, what's an easy way to get to it? What's in my bank account? That's what I buy with. If I want to buy a house, well, obviously it's going to be beyond what my bank account is. I'm going to need some credit. Well, what determines if I want to buy a new house? Interest rates, right? So I keep the first principle logic. And I find the results are a lot better. And we have every section. So we have capitalists. Capitalists are basically high net worth households. In our Messi model, I was actually chastised because capitalist is a dirty word in the financial realm, right? So we've had to change it to high net worth households. So high net worth households are pretty much the same as households, except they're buying bonds and they're buying equity assets, right? And so they have functions determining what that is. So for instance, buying bonds, right? When bonds become cheaper, their yields go higher, they'll buy bonds. When interest rates are yields are less, bonds are more expensive, they'll buy more equities, right? Basic principles like that will give you really complex results. I've always, like with the banking sector, so I have arguments with Doug about this. I really think the bank facilitates transactions and it creates currency, but really all it does, it is truly the lube. I shouldn't say lube. I'll say lube. It really is the lubrication of the economy. They don't make a lot of decisions. So in aggregate, the reason why money is created via loans is because the demand for them. There's not an aggregated loans officer that says, well, you know what? I don't think the economy's good enough for loans. So there's going to be less loans, right? So in this model, there's not a lot of equations that dictate, what banks do. That's all from the other agents in the model. But it's godly table. If I go make your little tabs, it's, the biggest one, right? Because it encapsulates all the transactions in the economy, whether from the central bank, the treasury, or all the agents in the private sector. It's going to be a large godly table. And anybody that's watching that doesn't know what a godly table is, well, it's simply a bunch of rows and columns. You have your assets, you have your liabilities, and you have your equity. The columns represent stocks, so bank accounts, etc., and then your flows are like wages, etc., etc. And by the way, anybody that wants to download Ravel, go to patreon.com/Ravelation. Is it Ravelation?
Revelation, yeah. Revel rather than Revel. Ravel, yeah.
So this I don't like this part here. This is the problem with a large model in Ravel, is I tend to try to break Ravel. So there's every different part. So I had to model in the foreign sector, and in this model, it's again basic principles. If the economy is producing less than it's using, it's obviously got to import. If it's producing more than it's consuming, then it'll export. But also that involves the other half of imports and exports, and that's your capital accounts, money going back and forth. If money is just continually leaving the model, it's going to come back in the form of capital investments, depending on the exchange rate and the interest rates and inflation. And we have ourselves a nice little foreign sector in the model. And, others. So have your monetary authority, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how I design a system, so I can visually see. It's almost like an art to me, and Steve will notice that because I look at how I bend those lines. It looks like the horse hair on a horse's tail, perfectly groomed.
Indeed. I mean, it's very well groomed stuff. Your models look beautiful, mate. This version, I don't know what's going on here. You're not running it, like that. I don't. Yeah. Well, I was going to run it, but I don't have scroll bars anymore, and my shift keys with this big model just don't work. So I'll bring up one of my models because I've got the smaller toy models compared to what you do, and
we're going to run it. We're going to run it.
Okay, go for a run. Yep. Okay, run away.
So I don't know why it's out of alignment. But so it runs endogenously without shocks. So this isn't our quantitative model. This would be our kind of sandbox version that will get published on applied MMT. So it just gives you basic endogenous business cycles over time, and it'll give you a select few parameters to adjust to try to bring your model in line with some sort of policy you want. It could be the traditional policy of keeping inflation between 1% and 3%. It could be a policy of keeping unemployment below 5%, right? And so it gives a user kind of will give a user kind of an introduction into dynamic systems that are nonlinear and aren't headed to an equilibrium. So there is never going to be a nirvana in this model. That doesn't happen. It means continuous policy adjustments as time moves forward, unless you get what Mike would call as a steady state error. In that case, the model's broken. We don't want that. And so this model doesn't do that. But so what the big deal here is the economy is inherently nonlinear. It's inherently complex, and in fact can show chaotic behavior, as you're kind of seeing in some of the variables. And there's going to be no flatlined dead patient on the table where everything's perfect. You don't have to pay taxes anymore. The business cycle, to a degree, is somewhat endogenous, although I admit exogenous shocks like productivity, population changes to the capital base can instigate a business cycle. But the underlying dynamics are truly driven endogenously by the system itself, in my opinion. And you can build out models just for people that are interested in downloading Ravel, right? You can really kind of plot out different parts of your model. I love this new tab feature. I think this is really cool.
Kind of look,
yeah, you look at your godly tables so you can see what's going on there in tabular form, or you can look at, your other interfaces, right? And just kind of organize everything really quickly. So it's a great design tool for economic modeling. And where you want to take it and how you apply it afterwards is obviously look at that nice endogenous behavior with the productivity growth, right? I love that chaotic stuff. It just tickles me pink. Stop sharing.
Before we get, that's brilliant stuff, Matt. I'm delighted to see it, and it's intriguing what you've done is using not just as a modeling tool in its own right, but as a way of producing the Python extension, tying it with AI, et cetera, But the underlying element is non-equilibrium dynamics, and that's the essential element of system dynamics in general. You don't have to. This equilibrium shit should have been thrown out in the 1920s, certainly the 1960s when J. Forrester turned up. So the fact neoclassicals have stuck with it shows how primitive they are. But the other side of it, and this is one point I'll finish on this one, is that a lot of my work is based on definitions. You can build macroeconomics from macro using macroeconomic definitions. That gives you the inherent consistency that the neoclassicals try to get from deriving from macro from micro, when that's not feasible in the first place and the micro was shit anyway. So it's the definitional foundation that really lies behind a huge part of the endogenous dynamics you get there.
Lana Dell, it's not about debunking Phillips, it's about debunking Friedman's bastardization of the Phillips curve, right? So there's two Phillips curves out there. The bastardization one is, I like using Steve's words because they're hard hitting. That is a menu between inflation and unemployment. That was not Bill Phillips' intended theory behind it. It's far more complex. And in fact, in the model and in Steve's, I think it was in Steve's doctoral paper, he actually showed how you could model Bill Phillips' actual equation. And so it's not just some trade-off between unemployment and inflation. So I just saw that come up, and it's what are we debunking? Debunking Bill Phillips? No,
No
we
way.
don't debunk that.
We're
He's a
manifesting
legend.
Bill Phillips. We're manifesting Bill Phillips. Yeah.
Right.
Forrester used to show.
Yeah.
Forrester used to show, and I've done it with some of my models, where from a completely, a causal representation and blah, 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 like, proper modeling, you can get a Phillips curve. You can just plot the data, sample it and plot it. You'll get a Phillips curve, a traditional Phillips curve, but it's not at all generated, the way the, Econ 101 says it's, generated with a trade-off between the two. But you can find it, if you just, with synthetic data, it's there. But there's no causal. The causal mechanism is quite more complicated.
I might go back
if anybody wants Phillips' original paper on the topic, email me at stevekeenandfriends@gmail, and I will send you the copy. I know I'm not supposed to do that. There's probably some copyright laws, but I think it's good to just get that paper out there so people understand what the real Phillips curve was all about.
Yeah. If I can share my... Sorry, you go, Mike. Yep.
I think Keynes's general theory was the most cited economics book of the 20th century. And I think Phillips's paper was the most cited economics paper of the 20th century, I think.
And you know what is also they've got in common? They're the most cited unread books and papers, respectively. Because you see what Phillips actually wrote. It's nothing like what these neoclassical twits put in their bloody lectures. And the trouble is, there is one point in that paper where Phillips made the mistake of describing an unemployment a trade-off between unemployment and inflation, a menu, and that's what actually led to its becoming so dominant. But in fact, when you read it, and you read where he came from, he was another system engineer, just like J. Forrester. He was actually using circuit diagrams, and he did a 56 paper, I think it was, where he had an argument about the level of economic activity and the rate of change of factor prices. And he simply drew a hyperbolic function at that point. So he's arguing both labor costs and raw materials costs and profit share would all be, would attempt to go higher during a period of high economic activity. And then he went to take a look at the data to explain it. But if you read that 57 paper, which I'd be delighted to have Ty centered around, he said there are three factors that determine the relationship between unemployment and the rate of change of money wages. That was what they're actually about, not in unemployment versus inflation. And you had as the level of unemployment, which is a highly nonlinear relationship, the rate of change of unemployment, which is the second dimension to the model, and cost push inflation, which he largely attributed to foreign trade issues. But there were those three elements to it. So rather than being a curve, it's a surface. And then what I did in my first model, I built the idea of the unemployment rate and the rate of change of the unemployment rate as determining the rate of change of money wages, and that then fed into inflation. Now, all of that you can do in any system dynamics tool because they're non-equilibrium. And that was the sort of world that Phillips is trying to talk in, rather than this bloody equilibrium shit that the neoclassicals have reduced it to.
So Sherry Wise is asking, was it Solow who bastardized Phillips' work? I think it was a paper by Solow and Samuelson where they applied Phillips's ideas to the U.S. economy, and they came up with the inflation unemployment trade-off. I should say
Milton Friedman and company popularized that version of the Phillips curve. So Solow, that's an obscure.
Well, they went into the long run, short run. Friedman, long run, short run, and Phelps did as well, right? So, but yeah, and that came later in the 60s. I should say too, system dynamics love Bill Phillips's work. There's some papers. One of Phillips's papers that I think Steve is alluding to. He had two of them there of note in the 50s related to systems modeling rather than the Phillips curve paper, have been reproduced in system dynamics, as well as his analog machine model has been reproduced in system dynamics. So we like that. We like his stuff. And Phillips was, he read Keynes after the war and was an electrical engineer. And he said, well, Lord Keynes is telling us to stabilize an unstable system, right? We're in the Great Depression, but capitalist systems go up and down, use the government's budget to do that. And Phillips said, well, in engineering, we use PID, proportional, integral, and derivative control, to do that very thing. So let me show you how in a macro economy, the government can not just willy-nilly manipulate its budget, but there are some rules that you could use using feedback loops. And I think Bill Phillips died despondent that he's going to be remembered for this Phillips curve thing. And it wasn't really what he said. And his work on PID controllers in the economy was ignored.
Yeah. I've actually, can I share the screen? Try just to give it a try and show one of my much simpler toy models to, okay, so illustrate some points here. Okay, so I'll go across and bring up one of my toy models here. Tell me when you can see it.
You got to press the share button.
Oh, pardon, I haven't done it. My mistake. I'll go back to the share button. Let's see. Actually, I might not be running I'm not running a browser where I can do that. My mistake. I've allowed this bloody thing in Microsoft Edge, and so I can't show it. But the basic point is, you get you have a bait model which is using system dynamics, but it's fundamentally derived from definitions. So you have a model where you can't criticize the foundations unless you criticize definitions, which are true by definition. That's the realistic foundation that lies behind my simple models and the advanced models that TIE generates. And what you get out of it is non-equilibrium cyclical behavior. And the essential difference in terms of the arguments that go into our models, which makes a difference to what the neoclassicals do, we include the endogenous creation of money by both banks and government. And that's left out of the conventional thinking. And it's all monetary. The foundations of monetary modeling. So that makes us a completely different class of models to what the neoclassicals do, where they leave banks and debt and money, credit creation, etc., completely out of their thinking. And they wonder why they don't wonder. They never apologize for getting the economy wrong. That's what I get really, really annoyed about them with. They got 2008 completely wrong. I've once heard one neoclassical say, we got it wrong, okay? And that was one because he can call over the coals by the then UK minister. There we go. He's got it running. It's one of my simple models there from TIE. So what you've got, you can just see the causal loop start up the top there. So you've got capital divided by capital output gives you GDP. Divide out GDP by an output to labour ratio, you get labour. Divided by population, you get the employment rate. Put that into a Phillips curve relationship, which is the linear one there. You get the wage rate. Multiply that by labour, you get wages. Subtract wages from profit, GDP, you get profit. Then got interest coming in as well, so this interest is being paid. That then gives you a rate of profit, which leads to an investment function, which will cause more borrowing. Hit the run, and then you get back. So it's a causal loop diagram, but it's actually derived from definitions. So if you run it, you get cyclical behavior, and you can get a range of dynamics that simply don't turn up in the neoclassical world because they don't include money in the first place, and they imagine everything stays in equilibrium. And there's emergent properties turning up on this and so on. This simple stuff is the foundation of what TIE has built with Messi. And I'm delighted to see Messi's a damn good game player as well as a damn good soccer player. So that's the fundamental dynamics there. This I first saw in August of 1992 when I first built my model of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. And what came out of it is the behavior you're seeing right here, which I had no expectation of seeing. I was simply trying to explain why a debt crisis can occur. And I simply wanted to have a system which gave me a rising level of private debt and then a crisis on the other side. But to see the phenomena here where the growth, you can see the growth rate cycles are getting smaller. And then they start to get larger again before you ultimately have a crisis. That's not in Hyman Minsky. That's something that is an addition to Minsky's theories, and it comes out of the mathematics because we get complex systems behavior. I had to go and research the complex systems literature to see what was actually occurring here. And what's actually going on is called the Pommeau-Maneville route to chaos, so they call it the intermittent route to chaos, which is part of the behavior of the Lorentz system of equations for fluid dynamics. And a couple of remarkable things about it. First of all, before a crisis occurs, you'll have diminishing and then rising cycles, which is what happened in the real world, the Great Moderation, followed by the 2008 crisis. Secondly, you can see in the middle of the two phase plots there, the left-hand side one, wages versus debt. The rising level of private debt comes at the expense of workers' share of GDP, even though the workers are not doing borrowing. What's actually going on is it's the dynamics of investment driving this. Capitalists basically invest when they invest their profits at a particular share of profit share of GDP. Above that, they borrow money. Below it, they pay debt back. So it doesn't matter to capitalists whether the remainder goes to workers or bankers. And because there's an increasing level of debt, there's an income distribution shift from workers to bankers. So the main enemy of workers is not capitalists, it's bankers. And that turns up in this model. And that's all emergent properties. And I've since found in recent years, I've realized I can derive this model directly from economic definitions. So the whole idea of needing micro foundations is garbage. The foundations of macro is macroeconomics itself, with the realism of including credit and the financial system. Okay, thanks for that, Ty.
So just maybe a couple of comments on modeling in general, because we're looking at my model is bigger than your model or whatever. And I think it behooves us to step back a bit and look at the bigger picture without a lot of the details here. And that is why are we going to build models, right? Now, Forrester would always tell us that, well, it's not a question of whether you're going to build models or use models or not, because you use models every day. You don't have a real economy inside of your head, city, family, university, club, church, whatever. You have mental representations of these systems. You have mental models, and you use them every day to make decisions. Now, mental models are pretty good. If you've been doing it every day, all day, you know a lot about whatever it is, right? But what we're very bad at is mentally simulating or thinking through the dynamic implications of our own mental models. We're a consensus around a conference table consensus mental model. And that's where, modeling, formal modeling, dynamic modeling can assist us. We take what we know, put it into a model. And if there's numerical data and written data, whatever, we can incorporate that as well. And the machine will mercilessly trace through the implication of the information we've given it. And often it's counterintuitive. It's not what we thought it would be, right? So why, from a system dynamics point of view, how and why do we build a model? Big picture. Okay, well, we want to, so this is where we'll disagree with Steve. We do look at micro foundations. We'll go and find out how, let's say, pricing is done in the electric power sector.
I did the same thing with real data rather than fictional models. Over time, there's a literature that's developed where we don't necessarily always have to get up from behind our chair and ask because somebody's already done it. And we can then take what people who do it every day tell us and put that into our model. So a model of the, steel production sector would look like a steel company. It would have an accounting sector, and it would have the sorts of decisions in it that real managers would make. What do they look at? Not every decision, including what are we going to have for lunch, but the important stuff, right? And then when we hook it all together, we want to see if it mimics the behavior of the real system endogenously. That's the key. What that means is if something's going like this up and down, we don't want to be driving it up and down with an external sinusoid, right? Because then it's a tautology. It goes up and down because we're making it go up and down. It doesn't tell us anything. What we want to do ideally is put the model into equilibrium. Ooh, poison word, but we do use it as a reference point, and then start some noise. And then the system will be shocked out of equilibrium, not with the sinusoid, but just random numbers. And guess what? If it's done right, it'll oscillate on its own endogenously. In other words, it's oscillating, if that's the problematic behavior, because of its design. It's the design of the system that's causing it to behave the way it is. And the noise is just revealing its natural behavior. Now, somebody may have consciously designed it that way, but more likely it has evolved over time to its current situation. So then the model, so the model is used to diagnose, what is the design of the system that's causing its problematic behavior. Then you use the model to diagnose where are their leverage points. You don't want to do this huge effort, time, money, people, and you get very little change in the system. You want it the other way, a little bit of effort, big change, right? So where are the leverage points? And we have tools and techniques for identifying the feedback processes that will give us a bang for the buck. Then you start to investigate, how do you redesign the airplane? How are you going to change things at the leverage point? Are you going to add a feedback process, sever a loop? What are you going to do, right?
and then hopefully the redesign will cause the system to behave better. So we're not trying to forecast because that's, claiming you can predict the future, but rather when the future comes to us, hits us, shocks us or whatever, we've got a design of our system, our institutions, our economy, so that it behaves better than it otherwise would. It can absorb the negative shocks and reinforce and profit from any positive shocks. So that's a very different sort of idea from macroeconomic forecasting or justifying the capitalist system or whatever, some people are trying to do with their modeling.
This is the info. This is the wrap you've done. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, this is just a beta version. So we have beta versions for the deep learning where we can talk to so just a work in progress. I just wanted let's kind of go to some of the high leverage divisive topics like government spending and some interesting things when we change. So we have government spending in this version here. Let's say we have 0 change in government spending for the pandemic. I'll just change. And let's just kind of see what actually happens. There's a lot of people, of course, from one side of the economic argument says that the huge bump in inflation was from massive government stimulus. Let's see what happens when I change. So this is with the change to no, so there's no additional government spending. Inflation actually goes up. And the reason why it goes up is because government is investing in capital. Some of its spending in firms actually increases the capital base, which increases supply in the model. And we have a very complicated inflation price level equation based on Koleski. So Steve, you'll know it as if you take the ratio of costs or firm costs and output, and you create a ratio and you feed it into that equation, and you have a constant rate of markup, which I think is how you do it in your toy models.
Yeah.
Ours is dynamic. So our rate of markup from firms is actually based on their profit levels. So there's empirical evidence that firms actually increase their markups during times of high profits and don't increase as much during low profits. So there's a lot of parts to it. But basically, the government spending, first and foremost, and we postulate that its best effect was it helped everybody settle their financial obligations. It wasn't about keeping the economy afloat per se. We had financial obligations, and if those obligations aren't met, we have financial chaos, i.e. if nobody pays their mortgages while they're temporarily home from work during a pandemic event, that's going to cause a financial crisis. But the other side effect of government spending is it's actually boosting the capital base. So when the economy does come back online, there's more supply, less inflationary pressure. So government spending was actually the opposite of inflationary. It made no difference in the initial part of inflation. That was actually caused by the supply issues with factories being shut down. And the government spending actually assisted in bringing inflation down to a manageable level, after this transitory period. So we can just put that back to some of the conditions that we had for the pandemic. We can extend this into the future to see where we're going. We're not going to say at Modern Macro Technologies this is the prediction, because we're still getting our deep learning model to really calibrate things before we put anything out. But we can go down the road of what's going to happen next. Right now, this model is predicting right now to 2024 October. Well, we can extend it. And obviously, there's a cone of uncertainty with any model. So we'll go to a year and 15 months from now. So 2026. And so this is without any changes to the policy rate, without any changes to the government stabilizing the economy, which Mike was talking about. We can see where we're going in the future here. Things we're looking at deflation. Now, keep in mind, I've kept the policy rate up at 4.75%. And this is something I thought about when all this was going down. I thought about Steve's simple Minsky Goodwin model and the amplitude of the cycles. And if you introduce a shock into his simple model, the one we were just showing where Steve was describing, you'll get these crazy oscillations. And I thought, geez, we got a crazy oscillation, high amplitude for inflation. I can only imagine what the low amplitude is going to be in a couple of years. So I've run a couple tests to see if fiscal policy would work. And unfortunately, we're too late to implement that. It would be, even if we put out some bills in the US, it takes time for them to get approved, takes time for the spending to go through the economy. So the only option is the policy rate, and the policy rate does have some effect over the long term in these situations. I'm not a big monetary policy guy. I believe that the rate should be kept at a stable level and just left alone for the most part, but we're in an extreme situation. So I do have a configuration here. Yeah, we got policy cuts. So we can load this one and run it. So throughout 2025, I did something that I think everybody's expecting in the US right now, and that's for continuous rate cuts all through next year in 2025. That does seem, and remember, I'm not a big fan of monetary policy, but in this situation, I think we're going to be seeing dramatic rate cuts through 2025. Don't start your investment strategies from that statement, but it seems like that is the only route to kind of prevent a deflationary period at this point. I know there's huge argument, there's a huge pushback, in the Keynesian world that, monetary policy has that effect. And what I've noticed with complex systems is one set of policies might work good at one point in where the system state is, but not in another point. For instance, the policy rate going up did nothing to help with inflation because it was a supply shock, right? But in this situation, it seems like it would help soft land us. In Fed speak, they call it sticking the landing. So we want to stick it at 2%. So that's kind of my rough prediction for 2025 is rate drops and the fear that we actually might be going into a deflationary period. Now, the US economy is not the world economy. Here in Canada, we're highly concerned right now about deflation. We're highly concerned, right? So it is a possibility that, the way this system's designed, that we might need to actually now be considering deflation as an issue as opposed to inflation. In fact, myself, I don't mind 5% inflation. I as long as wages are keeping track with that. And to me, that's actually would be a better number than 2%. Deflation, on the other hand, is problematic no matter what economic school you hail from. Even the Austrians don't advocate for falling price. They advocate for zero inflation, which is impossible to achieve, but whatever. So that's kind of some of the stuff we like to do with modeling. That right there, what we're doing is we're basically feeding this information to the deep learning model so it can adjust those parameters. And one thing I want to highlight is what Mike said is absolutely right. You don't want to have to jam these variables. So if we have an insight at Modern Macro Technologies, i.e. that when rates go up, firms counteract by marking up their prices to adjust for the costs, we're building that into the model so it behaves endogenously. And if we find that once we build that in, we come up with a good function, but it's not working correctly, that starts telling us, okay, maybe we're going down the wrong road. Read some more literature, look at some more empirical data. But Mike's absolutely right. One thing I hate more than anything is having to correct the data. I want our model to do it for us, and I want it to run for years on end, right? And there might be parameter adjustments. So the investment function, or the function that dictates why people buy houses, it might evolve over time, and we want deep learning to see that evolution and change it. That does occur, right? So your function parameters could change over time. And for your system dynamicists watching, that's your little table functions. Those numbers can change over time. That's a reality of an evolving system. And we want deep learning to do that. But structurally, we want the things in place so our model, gives the dynamic effects that right now we have to force with shocks to firm markups.
Very cool. Very cool. We're at the top of the hour by the looks of it.
Before we go, Mike, we got to give one more props. You got to do the list, buddy, before we go. Julia, bring up the list.
My turn. Well. All right, here we go. Tony Wilson, Ghost on the Half Shell. Agam the Bold, the Herald of Change, Dragai, Econ in One Lesson, Algorithm, Sherry Wise, Michael D'Souza Cruz, Riculus, Shot, David Collins, Zoe Lindsay, TR, The Hasty Ent, again, Michael D'Souza Cruz, Mangala Raj, Zarg 05, Paul Trainer, BSC, Rip the Jacker, Mary, Mag, Adam, David Sullivan, Siculori Economiche, Andrew Carey, Connor Howell, Paul Smith, Toby, Spittin' Feathers, Jupiter, Toby Veal, Owen Wall, Michael Newman, Bill Sticker, Bob Liori, Thomas Darlington, Andrew Baker, Gwen M., Andrew Carey, William Branch, Randy Osborne, cousin of Ozzy Osborne, Jen Zidek, Web Freaks, and D. Smith.
Yeah.
Wow.
Woo, yeah. All right.
Okay.
Well, that's another show. I think we got. I think it's Ed next week. I think we got your buddy Ed coming to the show. I think
that's right. Yeah, it as in J. Edgar, not Hoover. That's behind the fractal markets hypothesis.
Yes. So we're going to be talking about markets next week. Everybody likes talking about that stuff.
And I'm going to be in New York when it happens. It's going to be the day after the election, so I have a lot more to talk about than J. Edgar Peters. It is.
You're going to be Steve. You're going to be in New Haven on Friday.
I am in, mate. I'm looking forward to seeing you there.
I'll roll down. I have to teach that day, but I got somebody teaching my classes for me, so I'll come on down.
That's great. Looking forward to seeing you, mate. It'd be great to see you face to face.
Okay, everybody. Bye-bye. Thanks for tuning in. See you next week.
Bye all.